There may not be a more significant player to the game of baseball who is still excluded from the Hall of Fame than Curt Flood. Not because of what he did on the field, but for the changes he facilitated off the field. He was a 3-time All-Star who won 7 Gold Gloves in a row from 1963 to 69 as an elite center fielder. He was a 2-time World Series champion in 1964 and 1967. He amassed a career 41.9 WAR, and he finished 4th in the 1968 MVP voting, losing that year to his teammate, best friend, and roommate, Bob Gibson. Curt finished his career with 13 games for the Washington Senators under manager Ted Williams in 1971, but that was after a year out of the game. He had lost a step, was out of shape, and was battling alcoholism. He had suffered greatly between the end of 69 and the start of 71. You see, what makes Curt Flood's story so important is what happened between his time wearing the Cardinals red and the Senators red. He sued the commissioner of baseball and took his case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Today I'm joined by 3 friends of mine to discuss Curt and his impact on the game. First is Sean. This is his 4th time doing a video with me. Sean is he's got a passion for vintage baseball. He's taught me a lot over the last couple of years, and he is currently building the 1952 Topps set. Sean, thanks for joining me. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I'm just a huge baseball fan, baseball historian, and general nerd. So just happy to talk my favorite sport.
Awesome. Thanks. Also joining us is Mike. He's a friend of ours as well. Mike has a passion for labor issues, powerlifting, and facial hair. No, he's got that beautiful wall behind him. You're only seeing a fraction of it, and I'm hoping that he can speak to that a little bit. Mike just recently completed the 1960 Topps baseball set. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Gordon. I've also been a lifetime baseball fan and definitely a baseball nerd. As you mentioned, collect cards, but have a family history in labor unions, and it's been a interest of mine for quite some time with how it relates with labor relations in baseball. And I've got a photo wall behind me, as you can see, but I know we'll probably touch on them some today, but Montgomery Ward, Curt Flood, and Marvin Miller are people that have a place on my wall just due to their importance in the game.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then lastly, we have John. John is a friend of ours. He's here especially because he is a Cardinals fan, and he's what some may call a hoarder of Bob Gibson.
Thanks, Gordon. It's nice to be out here. So yes, I am the token Cardinal fan today, and I'm very excited to join your podcast and talk amongst all our friends. As you said, I'm a big Bob Gibson guy, also a big Ed Kenichi guy, and I have put together a couple small sets. I'm not as hardcore as you guys, so I try to keep them very small, under 100 cards at a time, to make it easy on my collecting OCD. So thanks for having me on.
John, that whole wall behind you is Bob Gibson, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So maybe you need to have a Curt Flood wall next to that Bob Gibson wall back there.
That's a great idea, Gordon. And actually, ironically, I wasn't able to procure this, but one of the collectors in St. Louis has a letter in his collection that's from Bob Gibson to Curt, telling him to keep up what he's doing, and don't pay attention to all the bullshit, if you want to leap that out or not. So I found that ironic that you had mentioned both of those guys. I think the difference between Bob and Curt, unfortunately, was I think Curt just he was the guy in the background. I mean, you had Bob Gibson, you had Ken Boyer, Orlando Cepeda, Lou Brock. You had just a lot of different superstars there that, Curt, his very strong guy, but not a very animated person. So I think when we talk about Curt Flood, sometimes he just kind of gets lost in the shuffle from a player perspective. So I don't know if that's what's kind of happened to him just within MLB lore, but Yeah, it's a very interesting topic to discuss. And to your point, I think I might have to start that Curt Flood registry site. So
First, a little history. Way back in 1879, there were 8 National League teams. The owners agreed to allow each club to reserve 5 players. These 5 players were off limits. The other owners agreed not to contact or attempt to sign the reserve players from the other teams. If a reserve player refused to sign with this club, the other 7 owners would make no attempt to sign him. Therefore, a reserve player had essentially no options but to accept the contract offered him by his club, or find another profession. A few years later, John Montgomery Ward, a future Hall of Famer and an Ivy League educated lawyer, wrote in Lippincott's Monthly, in which he argued the reserve clause was, quote, throttling business by stifling competition between the clubs. He said, quote, there is now no escape for the player. If he attempts to elude the operation of the rule, he becomes at once a professional outlaw, and the hand of every club is against him. Then in 1888, Ward wrote for Cosmopolitan, again arguing against the reserve clause, calling it entrapment of the player.
There have been efforts for well over 100 years for player rights in baseball. And if you go all the way back to 1885, Monty Ward was one of the founders or the creator of the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players. And that was really the first attempt to create kind of a trade union or something for players. And he ended up founding the Players League in 1890, and it was a standalone separate league that pulled about half of the players from the National League for that 1890 season. It ended up folding. They had good gate shares, or ticket revenue. The problem, though, I think really came down to that Monty Ward introduced revenue sharing. There was no, it was really intended to help benefit the players that were earning those ticket sales. And the owners of that league ended up not making the type of profits that they expected, and they sold their teams to the National League teams. So the season was done, the league was done, and everybody was back in the old system. But there were multiple attempts in the early 1900s to create similar types of unions. And it really wasn't until the Major League Baseball Players Association was created in 1956, but they weren't a union yet. And Bob Feller was their president in those first years. And it was, I think, culturally before that, really driven that players negotiated with owners. They did it separately. They didn't work together. And there wasn't the benefit of some collective bargaining.
Fast forward to 1969, and the reserve clause was still in effect. Though by this time it wasn't 5 players per team, it was 40. That's right, each team reserved 40 players who had no option but to sign for whatever deal they could muster with the club that owned them. It was collusion, and baseball was a monopoly operating in a fashion that would be illegal for any other business. But a Supreme Court decision back in 1922, the Federal Baseball Club of Baltimore versus National League of Professional Baseball Clubs, had set a precedent in which the court ruled that baseball was not interstate commerce, and thus not held to the Sherman antitrust law. The federal baseball decision in 1922 essentially gave baseball an antitrust exemption. This would be tested in court again 31 years later in Toolson versus the New York Yankees. A 29-year-old pitcher named George Toolson wanted out of the New York Yankees minor league system. Originally signed with the Red Sox, Toolson was traded to the Yankees. He wanted out of his contract, and he argued that baseball was interstate commerce. He argued that with radio and TV broadcasts, train and air travel between cities, and the expansion of minor league systems, that there was no question that baseball was interstate commerce. But the Supreme Court is historically very reluctant to reverse its own decisions. For decades, the court had hoped that Congress would settle the issue with legislation. For decades, Congress, are you ready to be shocked? Failed to do anything. Toolson lost his case, seemingly further strengthening baseball's antitrust exemption. The reserve clause continued and was in each player's contract, Paragraph 10A of the uniform player contract stated, quote, "The club shall have the right to renew this contract for a period of 1 year." Under this clause, the owners could renew a player's contract for 1 year indefinitely for as little as 80% of the previous season's salary. And yes, pay cuts did happen. Ted Williams had his salary cut 3 times over a 6-year period. Ted hit .356 with a 1200 OPS in 1956, and Tom Yawkey cut his salary. A contract in MLB in this era was essentially a contract for life, with no options for the player to get out from under the ownership in which he originally signed, or was drafted into. So now back to Curt Flood. After 14 years with the Cardinals, Curt was woken by a phone call at 4 a.m. on October 8th, 1969, by a sports writer, telling him that he had been traded to Philadelphia. Curt was sick to his stomach. He felt it was unfair. Yes, he signed the contract, but he had no other option if he wanted to play baseball. Curt refused to report to Philly. He threatened to retire at first, and then after discussing his situation with Major League Baseball Players Association Director Marvin Miller, he decided to sue Bowie Kuhn, the Commissioner of Baseball, over the legality of the reserve clause.
When Miller came in as the head of the union in '66, he previously had been on the National War Labor Board. He was an economic advisor and a negotiator for unions in his whole career. He'd been on the National War Labor Board. He was an advisor and a negotiator for the International Association of Machinists, the United Auto Workers, and the United Steel Workers before he moved into his role with Major League Baseball Players Association. He knew the economics. He knew labor law. He knew how to negotiate, and got pieces in place there in the late 60s, early 70s, and into the early 80s before the Reagan administration came in and tried to lessen some of the strength of unions in the country. And I think the Players Association became established right before all of that happened, got their power right before all of that happened. And then, historically, football-based basketball and hockey have kind of followed the lead of baseball. And I just think the timing maybe wasn't quite right. And they came in at a time when there wasn't as much support and strength for labor unions in this country.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And the other part, this is maybe going off on a bit of a tangent here too, but I think you can't understate how important Marvin Miller was, because he was all over it. His fingerprints all over it. He was incredibly capable and competent. Again, going back to the hockey side of things, the hockey union was started by a man named Alan Eagleson, who spent a lot of time in prison for embezzling funds and taking advantage of players that he acted as an agent. So he was in it for himself to line his own pockets, and because of that, you built a really weak union on the backbone of his work. Whereas Marvin Miller, again, what he did was absolutely incredible.
And he was big about promoting education of the players and changing the culture there. And I think that it just, struck fire, and everything just kind of, the stars all aligned at that time.
Marvin Miller set expectations up front that it would probably cost Curt his career. Curt's question to Miller was, quote, "But it would benefit all the players and all the players to come, wouldn't it?" Miller said, "Yes, it would." Curt replied, quote, "That's good enough for me." Curt's letter to Bowie Kuhn that preceded the lawsuit was sent on December 24, 1969. It read as follows: "Dear Mr. Kuhn, after 12 years in the major leagues, I do not feel that I am a piece of property to be bought and sold irrespective of my wishes. I believe that any system which produces that result violates my basic rights as a citizen and is inconsistent with the laws of the United States and of the several states. It is my desire to play in 1970, and I am capable of playing. I have received a contract offer from the Philadelphia club, but I believe I have the right to consider offers from other clubs before making any decisions. I therefore request that you make known to all major league clubs my feelings in this matter and advise them of my availability for the 1970 season. Sincerely yours, Curt Flood." Kuhn, having faced a similar threat the prior year in 1968 from Ken the Hawk Harrelson, believed that Curt would ultimately cave. The Hawk had threatened to retire, but eventually signed when more money was offered. Kuhn underestimated Curt Flood's fortitude. Curt's toughness was forged in the minor leagues in the Carolina League and the Sally League. The game was integrated, but racism was still rampant. In the minor leagues, Curt's uniform was washed separately from the rest of the clubs. He could not dress in the locker room with the white players. He could not find a place to even rent him a room until he found one on the campus of HBCU Savannah State. Once Curt's case made it to the Supreme Court, he was disappointed that he had virtually no support from current players. The union, it just wasn't as strong as it is today. Many players voiced their opposition to Curt, including Carl Yastrzemski, Harmon Killebrew, Robin Roberts, Joe DiMaggio, Joe Garagiola, Stan Musial, and Bob Feller, among others. They bought into the owner's line that killing the reserve clause would ruin baseball. And those that believed in Curt's cause feared to speak out publicly.
I tend to give the other players a lot of benefit of the doubt in the circumstances. So the big thing that Curt Flood was doing battle against was the reserve clause, which basically gave the teams unlimited rights to retain a player in perpetuity. So they controlled them for their entire career. And if you were an average player, a marginal player, a team could absolutely bury you in the minors and you would never see the light of day again. They controlled your career to such an extreme degree that they could just wipe you off the face of the earth as far as baseball is concerned. So to stick your neck out in support of that, very much for a lot of players, was putting your career on the line, and there was no certainty that the teams weren't going to retaliate if you took that stance that I'm going to support Curt Flood. So from that perspective, I really understand why he didn't have the support when he went to trial, because it was just such a high risk in that there were very few players in the game that were actually in a position that they could afford to take that risk and know that they would still have a job at the end of the day.
While Curt didn't receive support at trial from many players active at the time, he did have support from some big names in the game. Notably, 3 men who each faced their own adversity and were not afraid to stand up for what they believed was right. Jackie Robinson and Hank Greenberg both testified in court on Curt's behalf. Sandy Koufax spoke publicly in support of Curt and against the reserve clause. Sandy, having recently retired, had fought his own contract battle just a few years prior at the start of the 1966 season.
It was very obvious to anybody who was following the Dodgers that team ran on Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax. They were going to go as far as those two arms carried them. And at some point, the awakening happened between those two where they realized, okay, we are the reason for the team's success. We deserve to be paid for it. And the other part being is we also have an awful lot of leverage here because we know the team will not succeed without us on the diamond. So they collectively held out and basically held the Dodgers ransom and said, you pay us or you're going to be without your 2 best pitchers, and those World Series dreams you have for this season, you can kiss them goodbye because you're not winning anything without us.
John raises the additional point that public opinion, the everyday man, didn't understand Curt's issues.
I was going to say that I think he was making, $91,000, which in today's money was the equivalent of about almost $900,000. So yeah, he was making some significant money. And then I think the big thing, and you don't have to put this in the show or anything, but I think the big thing was when he referred to it as slavery. There was some pushback on that comment. Where normally slaves don't get paid, $90,000, and he's like, slavery is slavery regardless. So I thought that his comment back was really, really good.
The slavery comment John referred to was in an interview with Howard Cosell. On ABC's Wide World of Sports, Cosell had asked Curt Flood, quote, "It's been written, Curt, that you're a man who makes $90,000 a year, which isn't exactly slave wages. What's your retort to that?" Curt replied, "A well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave."
Yeah, the part that I found fascinating is actually Curt Flood didn't win his suit.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks he went to court, he sued, he won. That was free agency and the end of labor issue with baseball. And he lost. The Supreme Court said, no, baseball has an antitrust exemption. They have the right to do this in rather unique circumstances. And you don't get to dictate where you're going to go. The only reason it flowed through is it kind of opened the door to negotiations with the union, saying, okay, we recognize there have to be changes made, but even when they started off, those changes never included abandoning the reserve clause or adjusting that in any way. Basically, it was a couple of subsequent issues that really opened the door that allowed free agency to come to Major League Baseball. So the big one, as far as I'm concerned, was Dave McNally and Andy Messerschmidt. They played a season without a formal contract in place, which happened from time to time. But basically, Major League Baseball had agreed to an independent arbitrator. The arbitrator looked at the reserve clause and said the reserve clause gives the team the right to renew for a 1-year period. But they played an entire year without a contract in place. So basically, the arbitrator said, no, your year is up. You didn't renew the contract. These players are free agents. So that was the next domino to fall after the Curt Flood suit that really put things in motion to creating full free agency.
As Sean said, if you weren't already aware, it may surprise you, given today's landscape, that Curt lost his case at the Supreme Court. The reserve clause was upheld. But in arguing their case, the owners put forth that the reserve clause was a labor issue that should be addressed in labor negotiations. Ownership had consistently refused to even discuss the reserve clause in every previous labor negotiation. The lawsuit opened this door.
They opened the door in how they defended themselves in the lawsuit to protect themselves from losing that lawsuit and potentially losing their antitrust status. So then in that next collective bargaining agreement in the 70 through 72 seasons, that's where that independent panel for any issues that were not related to the integrity of baseball was created. And as you'd mentioned, Sean, that opened the door then for those players to play without their contract and essentially escape the reserve clause because they were outside of the terms of that original contract they had signed. After Curt's lawsuit was done, they had a strike for the 1972 season, and the 10-5 rule was part of the next collective bargaining agreement after the 72 strike.
The 10-5 rule allows any player who is a 10-year Major League veteran, including the last 5 with his current team, to veto a trade to another team. No reason needs to be given, and there's no need for the player to have a no-trade clause in his contract. It was first introduced in 1973. Ron Santo was the first player to invoke the clause when he refused to be dealt from the Chicago Cubs to the California Angels on December 5, 1973. Instead, the Cubs had to work out a deal acceptable to Santo, a trade to the crosstown Chicago White Sox, for whom he played the final season of his Hall of Fame career.
But again, all of these dominoes fell because of the awareness that Flood's lawsuit brought to baseball, both from players' perspective, but also in the public. Congress and the Supreme Court had started to say, you know what, your antitrust status may not be legit here or around forever. So they were really scrambling to try to justify what they had argued during Curt's lawsuit, that this could be done with negotiations. They painted themselves in a corner.
The lawsuit ruined Curt financially, physically, and mentally. He could not declare bankruptcy during the trial, otherwise a lawsuit would be terminated. A court-appointed receiver would have settled the lawsuit to pay his creditors. After the trial was over, Curt attempted a comeback. He signed to play for the Washington Senators, managed by Ted Williams. But the legal battle had taken a significant toll, and Curt was not the same player. He was also battling alcoholism, a fight that would take years to conquer. Curt died in 1997 at age 59 from throat cancer. No active players attended his funeral. A year later, in 1998, Congress passed the Curt Flood Act, which eliminated baseball's antitrust exemption. I'm sure you'd agree it's a shame that Curt was not alive to see that.
And the MLB PA award is named after Curt Flood. Just to I don't think we've mentioned that.
Until John brought this up, I honestly didn't even know about it. Shame on me. But since 2020, the MLB Players Association has awarded a former player, living or deceased, who in the image of Flood demonstrated a selfless, longtime devotion to the Players Association in advancement of players' rights. Andre Dawson won the initial Curt Flood Award in 2020, Mark Belanger in 21, Steve Rogers in 22, Phil Bradley in 23, and Dave Winfield last year in 2024. I wanted to get a report from boots on the ground as to how the St. Louis Cardinals maybe honor Curt Flood. I asked John if St. Louis had anything in Busch Stadium to commemorate Curt Flood.
Yeah, so basically went and saw the Cardinals play the Dodgers this Sunday with my godson and some of his friends that came in town. And the mission was to go around and find, see if there's any Curt Flood related just pictures, any sort of call outs, things of that nature. And walked around the stadium, didn't see much, went into a team store, which they didn't have a lot of even legends, which I saw a Mark McGwire jersey, which is kind of crazy when you think about all the different legends of the game for the Cardinals. Then I went into the memorabilia store and walked through that, tried to go find to see if there was any sort of Curt Flood memorabilia. Obviously, it's a little bit harder to find his stuff, given that he passed, so early in life. But I went to go find the Hall of Fame, Cardinal Hall of Fame plaque that they should have had, but they didn't even have that. And when I talked to one of the guys to go in and get another plaque, I mentioned Curt Flood, and he almost kind of grimaced to the, yes, Curt, we should have more Curt Flood things. He definitely should be honored more. So we kind of had a little bit of a discussion there about Curt. He was older gentleman, so he was there during that time, and it was just kind of an interesting take on, kind of as a whole, Curt is appreciated, but the Cardinals haven't done a really good job to celebrate that. I will caveat that, though. I have not gone over to the Cardinal Museum across the street in Ballpark Village, so that's kind of my next thing is to go through there, see if he's really represented like all the other folks. Like when I went there, obviously I was focused on Bob Gibson about a year ago, and he has a ton of stuff in there, as does Lou Brock and all those guys of that time. But I want to take a special trip and go back and kind of see what else, I don't want to speak out of turn and say they have nothing, but I want to kind of do some due diligence and follow up for my own personal benefit. So
it certainly seems that Curt should be honored in St. Louis, but what about Cooperstown, New York? I asked the guys what they thought about Flood and why he's not in the Hall of Fame.
Baseball, the Hall of Fame has a hard time with people who straddle multiple categories. So, for example, Buck O'Neil, no doubt, no-brainer Hall of Famer, but wasn't quite good enough as a player, maybe wasn't quite good enough as a manager, wasn't quite good enough as a coach, wasn't quite good enough as a scout, but taken collectively, there's no doubt that man should have been in the Hall of Fame from day one. Same goes with a guy like Lefty O'Doul. And I think Curt Flood's another one. As a player, his numbers are right on the fringe of being a Hall of Famer, irrespective of all the other stuff that comes with him. But as a pioneer and a trailblazer and a guy who stood up to the reserve clause in the institution of Major League Baseball, that alone should put him in the Hall of Fame. But taken collectively, it's a no-brainer. But again, the Hall of Fame really seems to struggle with guys who don't fit into one nice, tidy box.
I think.
Yeah, I would be shocked if. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
No, please, John. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I'd be shocked if he does not get elected into the Hall of Fame as a contributor. I mean, what is it? The 5-10 rule is the Curt Flood rule. There are multiple different laws that are passed because of Curt Flood. If you project his Hall of Fame, like to Sean's point, if you project, if he would have played to the age of 37, he probably would have ended up with, 2,400 hits, maybe 8 or 9 different Gold Gloves, which puts him in like elite status for center field. So hopefully people realize that, and it just takes, someone to kind of pick up the flag and carry it forward for Curt to where he would get in. So I'd be shocked if he doesn't get in eventually.
And I think the other thing, and Sean hit the nail on the head with people like Buck O'Neill, that no doubt that the contributions to the sport are immeasurable. And why did it take so long to get Buck O'Neill into the Hall of Fame? But the same thing happened with Marvin Miller. And he initially, people like Hank Aaron started petitioning for him in 2000. It took 20 years for him to get into the Hall of Fame posthumously. And if you look at the veteran committee that voted with Miller for or against Miller for so many years, there actually was a change in the components there. And Miller's votes went significantly down when the Veterans Committee at that time became mostly owners or management executive presence. I think he went from 8 votes to 3 votes the next go round. So Miller built the MLBPA into one of the strongest unions in the country. That the impact that he had on the game was, in my opinion, you're talking, in my mind, Babe Ruth, Jackie Robinson, and Marvin Miller had probably the biggest impact on the game as individuals. Curt Flood was an incredibly important part of that. And when you're combining his contributions to the game on the field and off the field here, it shocks me that he's not. But you look at, there's still, I think, some resistance to accept people that shook the boat, that rocked the boat.
I was going to say, if you look at his career numbers across the board, he has better counting stats than Phil Rizzuto, who, not the same position, but Phil Rizzuto was in the Hall of Fame and Curt Flood is on the outside looking in.
I can't end this video without touching on the baseball card hobby. Mike shares some interesting facts related to the hobby.
I thought it was really interesting that we're all big baseball card nuts, but one of the other reasons for the MLBPA getting its power was baseball cards. And in 1966, Topps, the contract for all the players was $125 per person, per player, to agree to give their likeness for baseball cards to Topps.
Yeah.
And that same year, Miller negotiated licensure with Coke. And so you'll see the 66 bottle caps that have players' faces under the bottle cap lid, where the logo is airbrushed off of their hats and stuff. And that's what gave the leverage to the MLBPA to go back to Topps. So the next year, they signed a contract with Topps collectively that gave players, instead of the $125 and the choice of a toaster or something out of their catalog, it gave them $250 each plus a percentage of the royalties. And that year, the MLBPA brought in, from royalties alone, over $300,000.
Wow.
So before that, the MLBPA under Feller and then the next individual, they were getting $150,000 a year or something for their entire operations from Major League Baseball. So they were being limited and fed a small amount of money. They didn't have an office. They didn't have any staff or anything like that. That the licensure with and the collective negotiating for players' likenesses on cards is what funded the MLBPA in order to fight for all of this in that time frame.